Elizabeth Morgan stood at the kitchen island, methodically chopping vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board matched the ticking of the wall clock, steady, predictable, unchanging. Like her marriage to David, now in its 18th year. She glanced at her watch. 6:45. David would be home by 7:30, as he always was on Thursdays. He would greet her with a kiss on the cheek, pour himself a glass of wine, and ask about her day while scrolling through emails on his phone. She would tell him about her meeting with a client at the interior design firm where she worked, and he would nod without looking up. Later, they would eat dinner at the table, exchange pleasantries about their respective days, and retreat to separate corners of the house, David to his study to catch up on work, Elizabeth to the living room to sketch new design concepts or read. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. This was their rhythm, comfortable and worn like an old sweater. When had comfort morphed into complacency? When had predictability become a prison? Elizabeth sighed, pushing a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. At 43, she was still attractive, her green eyes bright, her smile genuine if somewhat less frequent these days. Motherhood and marriage had changed her body, but she kept fit with morning runs and yoga. David still called her beautiful on occasion, usually before social events or when intoxicated, the words sounding more like habit than revelation. Their daughter, Lily, was now a sophomore at Berkeley, her absence leaving the house with a hollowness that neither Elizabeth nor David seemed able to fill. The silence between them stretched longer each day, filled with words unsaid and feelings unexplored. The sound of her phone ringing pulled Elizabeth from her thoughts. She wiped her hands on a towel and checked the screen. Mark Henderson, David's colleague from the architectural firm, where they both worked as partners. "Hello," she answered, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder as she continued chopping. "Elizabeth, hi. It's Mark." His voice was distinctive, slightly husky with a warmth that always made her feel he was genuinely pleased to speak with her. Unlike most of David's colleagues, who treated her with polite indifference at company functions, Mark engaged with her, asked questions about her work, and actually listened to her answers. "Mark, hi. David's not home yet. Actually, I was calling for you. About the gala fundraiser next month. David mentioned you might be willing to help with the design committee since they're short-handed." Elizabeth paused, knife suspended above the cutting board. "He didn't mention it to me." "Oh." A beat of silence. "Well, that's David for you. Probably got caught up in the Henderson project and forgot. But we could really use someone with your eye for design. The proceeds go to the children's hospital expansion." Elizabeth felt a small spark of pleasure at being sought out for her professional skills, rather than as David's wife. What would it involve? Mostly helping to transform the hotel ballroom from its usual corporate blandness into something spectacular. Working with the florist, selecting linens, lighting design. Your expertise would be invaluable. Elizabeth found herself smiling. "That actually sounds lovely. When would you need me?" "There's a committee meeting tomorrow afternoon at 4 if you're free. At the firm. I know it's short notice. She should check with David first. That would be the proper thing to do." But something rebellious stirred in her, a desire to make a decision without consultation, to be valued for her own talents. "I'll be there," she said. "Great. I'll text you the details." "And Elizabeth?" "Yes. Thank you. This means a lot." After they hung up, Elizabeth stood motionless in the kitchen, aware of a subtle shift in her mood. She felt lighter, energized in a way she hadn't in months. The thought of the committee meeting tomorrow gave her something to anticipate, a small disruption in the predictable rhythm of her days. When David arrived home at precisely 7:28, Elizabeth was plating their dinner, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables. "Something smells good," he said, placing his briefcase by the kitchen door and loosening his tie. He gave her the expected peck on the cheek and reached for the wine bottle. "How was your day?" she asked, watching him pour a generous glass of Cabernet. "Busy. The Henderson project is hitting some roadblocks with the city's historical preservation board." He took a long sip. "You? Good. I finalized the design for the Petersons' living room." She paused, waiting to see if he would mention the fundraiser committee. When he didn't, she added, "Mark Henderson called." David looked up from his phone. "Mark? What did he want?" He asked if I could help with the design committee for next month's gala. For the children's hospital. Oh, right. David nodded absently. Must have slipped my mind to mention it. The firm needs volunteers. Did you agree? I did. There's a meeting tomorrow at 4. Good. They'll be lucky to have you. His attention was already drifting back to his phone. They ate dinner with their usual sparse conversation. David talked about work challenges, while Elizabeth noticed how seldom he asked about her day or her thoughts. When had they stopped being curious about each other? Later that night, as she lay beside David in their bed, listening to his even breathing, Elizabeth found herself thinking about Mark. She remembered their first meeting at a company Christmas party 3 years ago. David had been caught up with clients, and she'd been standing alone near the bar when Mark approached. Unlike most of David's colleagues who treated spouses as ornamental, Mark had engaged her in genuine conversation about architecture and design. He'd asked her opinion on the adaptive reuse project the firm was undertaking, and they'd spent nearly an hour discussing the challenges of modernizing historical structures while preserving their character. Since then, their interactions had been infrequent, but always stimulating. At company events, they inevitably found themselves in conversation, often losing track of time. Elizabeth had noticed how Mark's blue eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, how he leaned in slightly when she spoke, as if her words were valuable treasures he didn't want to miss. She rolled onto her side, facing away from David's sleeping form. The thought of seeing Mark tomorrow brought a flutter of anticipation that both excited and alarmed her. She was a married woman in her 40s, not some lovesick teenager. Yet she couldn't deny the spark of life she felt when thinking about their upcoming interaction, a vitality that had been absent from her marriage for longer than she cared to admit. Elizabeth closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep, but her mind kept returning to Mark's voice on the phone, the warmth in his tone when he thanked her. It was just a committee meeting, she told herself. Just a professional interaction with her husband's colleague. Nothing more. But as sleep finally claimed her, Elizabeth knew she was lying to herself. Something had shifted, some dormant part of her awakening from a long slumber, and she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to put it back to sleep. The next day, Elizabeth found herself spending an unusual amount of time selecting her outfit for the committee meeting. She finally settled on a forest green wrap dress that complemented her eyes and auburn hair, paired with modest heels. Professional but flattering. She applied makeup with more care than usual, adding a touch of color to her lips that she typically reserved for special occasions. As she drove to the architectural firm, Elizabeth chastised herself for her schoolgirl nervousness. She was simply attending a meeting for a charity fundraiser. Her husband's office was in the same building. There was nothing inappropriate about any of this. The receptionist directed her to a conference room on the 4th floor. When she entered, several people were already seated around a large table, including Mark, who stood immediately upon seeing her. "Elizabeth, thank you for coming." His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes. He introduced her to the other committee members, 2 women from the hospital board, another architect from the firm, and a representative from the hotel venue. "We're thrilled to have someone with your design expertise," said one of the hospital board members. "Mark has been singing your praises." Elizabeth felt a flush of pleasure as she took the seat Mark had pulled out for her coincidentally, right next to his. Their arms brushed as they both reached for the meeting agenda, the brief contact sending an unexpected jolt through her. "Sorry," they said in unison, then laughed. The meeting proceeded efficiently, with discussions about budget, potential themes, and logistical concerns. Elizabeth found herself fully engaged, offering suggestions about lighting techniques that could transform the space without excessive cost. The committee responded enthusiastically to her ideas. "This is exactly why we needed you," Mark said, his eyes meeting hers with appreciation. "You see possibilities the rest of us miss." The meeting concluded after an hour, with assignments distributed among the members. Elizabeth would visit the venue the following week to assess the space and develop a comprehensive design plan. As the others filed out, Mark lingered. "Do you have time for coffee? I'd love to hear more about your thoughts for the space." Elizabeth hesitated. Coffee with a colleague was perfectly innocent, yet something about Mark's invitation felt weighted with possibility. "I should probably check if David is ready to head home," she said, the responsible response. "Of course." Mark's expression revealed nothing, but she thought she detected a flicker of disappointment. Another time, perhaps. She nodded, gathering her notes. I'll see you next week at the venue walkthrough. Looking forward to it, he replied, holding her gaze a moment longer than necessary. Elizabeth made her way to David's office, her thoughts in disarray. Why had she declined coffee? Was she overreacting to an innocent professional interaction? Or was she right to establish boundaries where none seemed necessary? David was on a call when she arrived, gesturing for her to wait. She watched him through the glass wall of his office, confident, authoritative, completely in his element. The man she had fallen in love with 20 years ago. Yet somehow, over the years, they had drifted into parallel lives, connected but separate. When had David last looked at her the way Mark had in the conference room, as if her thoughts were fascinating, her presence a gift? David ended his call and waved her in. How was the committee meeting? Good. Productive. She hesitated. Mark asked me to coffee afterward to discuss design ideas, but I said I should check if you were ready to leave. David was already checking his email again. You didn't need to do that. I've got at least another hour here. You should have gone. Oh. Elizabeth felt oddly deflated by his response. Had she wanted him to be jealous? To claim her time? Well, it's fine. We'll have time to discuss everything at the venue walkthrough next week. David nodded absently. That's good of you to help with this, Liz. The firm appreciates it. The firm. Not him. Not Mark specifically. I should get home and start dinner, she said. I'll be late. Don't wait for me. He barely looked up as she left. Driving home alone, Elizabeth found herself replaying moments from the meeting, the way Mark leaned forward when she spoke, how his fingers had accidentally brushed hers when passing a document, the intensity in his eyes when he thanked her for her contributions. Small moments, meaningless in isolation, yet together they formed a pattern that both thrilled and troubled her. She had done nothing wrong, she reminded herself. Yet the flutter in her stomach when she thought about seeing Mark again felt like a betrayal of sorts, not of actions, but of emotions. At home, in the emptiness of a house that no longer contained a child's laughter or the energetic chaos of family life, Elizabeth poured herself a glass of wine and stood at the kitchen window, watching the setting sun paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. The beauty struck her with unexpected force, and she realized how long it had been since she truly noticed such things: the shifting colors of the sky, the precise quality of early evening light, the silent poetry of shadows lengthening across the lawn. She had let parts of herself go dormant, the parts that noticed beauty, that felt passion, that yearned for connection beyond the comfortable routine she and David had established. Now those dormant parts were stirring, awakened not by her husband of 18 years, but by brief moments of genuine connection with another man. Elizabeth took a long sip of wine, the realization settling over her with equal parts excitement and dread. She wasn't looking for an affair. She didn't want to destroy her marriage or hurt David, but she couldn't deny the hunger that had awakened in her, not just for physical intimacy, though that was part of it, but for the simple pleasure of being seen, being heard, being valued. As darkness fell, Elizabeth remained at the window, watching as lights came on in neighboring houses, illuminating other lives, other stories. She wondered how many other women stood in darkened kitchens contemplating the shape of their marriages, the contours of their desires, the silent spaces between what they had and what they wanted. When her phone chimed with a text message, her heart quickened. She looked at the screen. Mark, thanks again for joining the committee. Your ideas were brilliant. Looking forward to working with you on this project. A simple professional message. Nothing inappropriate. Yet Elizabeth stared at it for long minutes, her finger hovering over the reply button, aware that how she responded mattered to her marriage, to her sense of self, to whatever undefined thing was stirring between her and Mark. Finally, she typed, "Happy to help. See you at the walkthrough. Neutral. Safe. True." But as she set her phone down and poured another glass of wine, Elizabeth knew that safety was not what her heart was longing for. The week following the committee meeting passed with excruciating slowness. Elizabeth found herself counting the days until Tuesday's venue walkthrough, then chiding herself for such adolescent anticipation. She threw herself into work, taking on 2 new clients and spending long hours at her drafting table, as if intense focus on interior spaces might distract her from her interior life. David noticed, nothing unusual in her behavior. Their routine continued unchanged, parallel lives intersecting for meals and sleep, exchanging information rather than intimacies. On Sunday morning, as they sat across from each other at breakfast, newspapers creating physical barriers between them, Elizabeth studied her husband over the top of the lifestyle section. At 46, David remained handsome, his dark hair now threaded with silver at the temples, laugh lines deepening around his eyes. When had she stopped really looking at him? When had he stopped really seeing her? "I was thinking," she began, lowering her paper, "maybe we could do something different next weekend. Drive up the coast, maybe stay overnight somewhere." David glanced up, surprised. "Next weekend? I've got the Henderson presentation on Monday. You could work on it during the week." He frowned slightly. "It's not that simple, Liz. This project is crucial for the firm." He returned to his newspaper. "Maybe in a few weeks when things settle down." Things never settled down. There was always another project, another deadline, another reason to postpone living. Elizabeth felt a familiar disappointment settle in her chest, followed by a flicker of resentment. She couldn't remember the last time David had prioritized their relationship over work. "I have the venue walkthrough on Tuesday," she said. "For the gala." He turned a page. "What time? I might be able to stop by." "You don't need to do that." The words came out more sharply than she intended. David looked up, finally giving her his full attention. "Is everything okay, Liz?" She considered telling him, then not about Mark specifically, since there was nothing concrete to tell, but about her dissatisfaction, her loneliness, her hunger for something more than their comfortable coexistence. Instead, she said, "I'm fine. Just busy with work." He nodded, already retreating behind his newspaper. "We both are. It's just a busy season." Their entire marriage had become a busy season, Elizabeth thought, watching him return to his reading. When was the last time they had had a real conversation that wasn't about schedules, finances, or their daughter? When was the last time they had looked at each other with desire rather than familiarity? Tuesday arrived with a clarity of sky that seemed to mock Elizabeth's internal confusion. She dressed with particular care, a silk blouse in a deep teal that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, tailored black pants, and heels that added 2 inches to her 5'6" frame. Professional but striking. She applied makeup with precision, then removed and reapplied her lipstick, dissatisfied with the first shade. The venue walkthrough was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Mark had texted the previous evening to confirm, a simple professional message that nonetheless sent her heart racing. Elizabeth had shown the text to David over dinner, a deliberate act of transparency that felt both righteous and deceptive. He had barely glanced at it, mumbling something about being glad the committee was on track. Elizabeth arrived at the hotel 15 minutes early, her design portfolio tucked under her arm. The grand ballroom was empty when she entered, the vastness of it emphasized by rows of stacked chairs against one wall and bare round tables scattered throughout the space. Afternoon light filtered through tall windows, creating patterns on the parquet floor. She moved slowly through the room, mentally transforming the blank canvas. The space had good bones, high ceilings with ornate molding, crystal chandeliers that needed only proper cleaning to sparkle, elegant proportions. Elizabeth began sketching in her notebook, ideas flowing freely for the first time in weeks. "You look completely in your element." She turned to find Mark watching her from the doorway, his expression appreciative. He wore a charcoal suit that fit his lean frame perfectly, a light blue shirt open at the collar. No tie. The casual elegance of it struck her as quintessentially Mark, professional but unconventional. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked, closing her notebook. "Just a moment." He crossed the room toward her. "Your focus was impressive. Already having ideas." She nodded, suddenly aware of how alone they were in the vast space. The room has excellent architectural features to work with. The moldings, the proportions. "Show me what you're thinking." They stood side by side as she reopened her notebook, their shoulders nearly touching as she pointed out her preliminary sketches. Mark leaned in to see better, his cologne something subtle with notes of cedar enveloping her. "You're thinking of creating different zones within the space," he observed. Elizabeth nodded, pleased by his quick understanding. "Exactly. The main dining area here, a lounge section there near the windows, and a more intimate bar area in that alcove. It's brilliant." creating a flow that encourages both mingling and private conversations. His genuine appreciation of her ideas, so different from David's polite but distant acknowledgement of her work, warmed her more than it should have. They walked the space together, discussing lighting possibilities, table arrangements, and how to incorporate the children's hospital theme without making the gala feel clinical or maudlin. "What about here?" Mark gestured to a small anteroom off the main ballroom. "This space seems isolated." They entered the smaller room together. It was darker than the main ballroom, with just one window and lower ceilings. Their voices echoed slightly in the empty space. "It's perfect for a quiet exhibition area," Elizabeth said. "We could display artwork from the children at the hospital, maybe set up information about the expansion project for potential major donors." Mark nodded, studying not the room but her. "You see possibilities everywhere." "It's my job," she said lightly, though something in his gaze made her pulse quicken. "It's more than that. It's how you see the world." He paused. David is a lucky man. The mention of her husband's name hung between them, a reminder of invisible boundaries. Elizabeth took a small step back, creating physical distance. "The rest of the committee should be here soon," she said, glancing at her watch. Mark nodded, accepting the change in tone. "They're actually not coming. The hotel liaison had an emergency, and the others thought we could handle the initial walkthrough ourselves." "Oh!" Elizabeth felt a flutter of both alarm and anticipation. "You should have told me. Would it have changed your decision to come?" His question was direct, his eyes holding hers. Elizabeth considered lying, then decided against it. "No." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "That's what I thought." He gestured toward the main ballroom. "Shall we continue?" They spent the next hour methodically examining the space, discussing technical requirements for lighting and sound, measuring dimensions, and checking electrical outlets. Their conversation remained strictly professional, yet Elizabeth was acutely aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance, every moment when their laughter synchronized. "I think we've covered everything," Mark said finally, checking his notes. "Unless there's something else you want to see?" Elizabeth shook her head, oddly reluctant for their time together to end. "I think I have what I need to develop the design proposal." "Coffee," he suggested, "to discuss next steps." This time, she didn't hesitate. "I'd like that." They found a small cafe 2 blocks from the hotel, a quiet place with round tables and comfortable chairs. Elizabeth texted David that she would be late, explaining about the design meeting running over. It wasn't exactly a lie, but the omission of with whom and where felt significant. Over cappuccinos, they discussed the gala initially, but the conversation gradually shifted to more personal topics, their respective paths into their professions, books they'd recently read, places they hoped to travel. "What about Italy?" Mark asked. "Have you been?" Elizabeth shook her head. "It's always been on my list, especially Florence for the architecture and art. David promised we'd go for our 10th anniversary, but then the firm was in the middle of a major project. And the trip never happened," Mark finished for her. "Life gets in the way sometimes." She stirred her coffee. "What about you?" "No wife insisting on romantic Italian getaways. Divorced. 3 years now." He said it matter-of-factly. "Karen and I married young. By 40, we had become different people with different priorities." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was amicable as these things go. No children, which made it simpler. We just grew apart." He looked at her intently. "Has that ever happened to you and David? Growing in different directions?" The question was too direct, too perceptive. Elizabeth looked down at her coffee. "All marriages evolve." "That's not what I asked." She met his gaze. "Yes. Sometimes I think we've grown in different directions." It was the first time she had voiced the thought aloud, and the admission felt both terrifying and liberating. Mark nodded, not looking triumphant or pleased, but simply understanding. "What do you do when you realize that?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Try harder. Accept it. I'm not sure there's a right answer. There rarely is with relationships." He reached across the table, his fingers briefly touching the back of her hand, a gesture of comfort that lingered just long enough to become something more. "For what it's worth, I think anyone who stops being curious about you is missing something extraordinary." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. She should pull her hand away, change the subject, establish a boundary. Instead, she found herself turning her palm upward, her fingers interlacing with his for the briefest moment before she came to her senses and withdrew. "I should get home," she said, gathering her portfolio. "David will be wondering where I am." Mark nodded, not pressing but not retreating either. Of course. He paid for their coffees despite her protests, then walked her to her car. As they reached the vehicle, he said, "Elizabeth, I want to be clear about something." She paused, keys in hand, heart racing. "Yes, I respect your marriage. I respect David as a colleague. I'm not trying to," he stopped, reformulating his thoughts. "I enjoy your company. I value your perspective. Whatever else might exist between us, that's entirely up to you." His words placed the responsibility squarely on her shoulders, which was both honest and unfair. Elizabeth opened her car door, creating a barrier between them. "Thank you for today," she said carefully. "I'll have the design proposal ready by Friday's committee meeting." He nodded, accepting her retreat to professional topics. "I look forward to it." As she drove home, Elizabeth's thoughts were in turmoil. She had crossed no definitive line, yet the emotional connection forming between her and Mark felt like a betrayal of her marriage vows. The brief touch of their hands, innocent by any objective standard, replayed in her mind, each time with greater significance. David was already home when she arrived, unusual for a Tuesday. He was in the kitchen, attempting to prepare dinner, something he did perhaps 3 times a year. "You're cooking," she said, surprise temporarily displacing her guilt. He looked up with a self-deprecating smile. "Trying to. You mentioned wanting to do something different, so I thought, surprise." The gesture touched her deeply, all the more because it was so unexpected. David had made an effort, however small, to respond to her dissatisfaction. He had noticed after all. "Thank you," she said, setting down her portfolio and moving to help him. "What are we making?" "That pasta dish you like." With the sun-dried tomatoes, he was chopping garlic with more enthusiasm than skill. "How was the venue walkthrough?" Elizabeth hesitated, then opted for a partial truth. "Good. The space has excellent potential. Only Mark and I ended up going since the others had conflicts." David nodded absently, focused on not cutting himself. "Mark's a good guy. One of the best architects at the firm. Brilliant with spaces." "Yes, he is." Elizabeth busied herself with washing vegetables, her back to David. "We had coffee afterward to discuss design ideas." "Good." David seemed genuinely pleased. "I'm glad you're enjoying this project." "You've seemed, I don't know, restless lately." The observation, so close to the truth yet missing its essential nature, nearly undid her. Elizabeth blinked back unexpected tears. "Have I?" David moved behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders, a rare, spontaneous touch. "You know I appreciate you, right? All you do for us, for me." Elizabeth leaned back against him, allowing herself to be held. This was her husband of 18 years, the father of her child, the man who had built a life with her. "I know." They stood like that for a moment, close but not quite connecting, before David returned to his cooking and Elizabeth to her thoughts. Throughout dinner, as David talked about work and she responded appropriately, Elizabeth was aware of a fundamental dishonesty in her behavior. Not because she had done anything explicitly wrong, but because she was harboring feelings she couldn't share with him. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, David initiated sex, something that had become increasingly rare in recent months. Elizabeth responded to his familiar touches, closing her eyes in the darkness of their bedroom. But unbidden, Mark's face appeared in her mind, his intense gaze, his attentive expression when she spoke, the brief warm touch of his hand on hers. She pushed the image away, focusing on her husband, on the physicality of the moment. Yet afterward, as David slept beside her, Elizabeth lay awake, torn between guilt and longing, between the safety of what she had and the allure of what she didn't. The rest of the week passed in a blur of work commitments and preparations for Friday's committee meeting. Elizabeth threw herself into creating a comprehensive design proposal for the gala, working late into the night on detailed renderings and mood boards. The intensity of her focus was partly professional dedication and partly an attempt to distract herself from thoughts of Mark. They exchanged several professional emails about the project, each message cordial but carefully impersonal. Elizabeth analyzed every word for hidden meanings, then chastised herself for the adolescent behavior. She was a grown woman, not a teenager with a crush. Yet when Friday arrived, she dressed with particular care, selecting a structured navy dress that was both professional and flattering. She arrived at the meeting room 10 minutes early, her presentation materials meticulously organized. Mark was already there, arranging chairs around the conference table. He looked up when she entered, his expression brightening. "Elizabeth, good morning." "Morning." She busied herself with setting up her materials, avoiding prolonged eye contact. "Is everyone coming today?" "Should be." "Coffee." He gestured to the carafe on a side table. "Please." He brought her a cup, prepared exactly as she liked it, a detail he must have noticed during their cafe conversation. The thoughtfulness of it affected her more than it should have. "Thank you." She accepted the cup, their fingers brushing momentarily. "About Tuesday," he began, his voice low. "Mark, please. We don't need to. I just want to say that I meant what I said. Whatever happens or doesn't happen between us is entirely your decision. I won't pressure you." His eyes held hers. "But I won't pretend I don't feel what I feel either." Before she could respond, the door opened and other committee members began arriving. The moment passed, but Mark's words lingered, acknowledgement of feelings that created both possibility and danger. Throughout the meeting, Elizabeth maintained strict professionalism, presenting her design concepts with clarity and confidence. The committee responded enthusiastically, approving her proposals with minimal changes. Mark's support was vocal but appropriate. His praise focused on her professional expertise rather than personal attributes. As the meeting concluded and people gathered their belongings, Elizabeth felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find David standing there, a surprise that momentarily disoriented her. "David, what are you doing here?" "Thought I'd surprise you." He smiled, planting a quick kiss on her cheek. "See how the committee's going. Maybe take my wife to lunch." Elizabeth was acutely aware of Mark watching this interaction from across the room, his expression unreadable. That's wonderful." David turned to Mark, extending his hand. "Henderson, how's it going? Treating my wife well on this committee of yours?" "Of course." Mark's handshake was firm, his smile professional. "Elizabeth is the star of the show. Her design concepts are exceptional. She always has been talented," David said, his arm going around Elizabeth's waist in a gesture that felt both loving and oddly possessive. "Ready for lunch, Liz?" Elizabeth nodded, gathering her materials. As David chatted with another committee member, Mark helped her organize her presentation boards. "Unexpected visit?" he asked quietly. "Very." She couldn't read his tone, whether he was implying David was checking up on her or genuinely curious. "Enjoy your lunch." Mark's voice was neutral, but his eyes conveyed something more complex: disappointment, understanding, resignation. "The designs really are brilliant, Elizabeth." "Thank you." She hesitated, feeling an urgent need to explain something she couldn't articulate even to herself. "Mark, Ready," David interrupted, returning to her side. Elizabeth nodded, forcing a smile. "Ready." As they left the conference room, David's hand warm against the small of her back, Elizabeth glanced over her shoulder. Mark was watching them go, his expression now clearly revealing what he had earlier concealed: longing, tinged with a sad acceptance that some lines, once drawn, were not meant to be crossed. The weekend following the committee meeting unfolded with a strange blend of tension and tenderness. David, seemingly jolted out of complacency by some instinct he couldn't or wouldn't name, made uncharacteristic efforts toward connection. He suggested a Saturday night dinner at the upscale restaurant where they had celebrated their 10th anniversary, brought home flowers on Sunday morning, and engaged in conversations that ventured beyond logistics and schedules. Elizabeth responded to these gestures with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. She wanted to sink back into the comfort of her marriage, to feel that David's renewed attention was enough to quell the restlessness in her spirit. Yet thoughts of Mark persisted, surfacing in quiet moments like bubbles in still water. On Sunday evening, as she and David sat on their back patio watching the sunset, wine glasses in hand, he asked an unexpected question. "Are you happy, Liz?" The directness startled her. They rarely discussed emotional states, having long ago settled into a pattern where contentment was assumed rather than confirmed. Elizabeth took a sip of wine, buying time. "That's a big question," she finally said. "Are you?" David considered this, swirling the wine in his glass. "I thought I was. Or maybe I didn't think about it at all, which might be the problem." His insight surprised her. "What brought this on?" "Something Mark said at the office yesterday." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. "Mark!" David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We were reviewing some designs, and he mentioned how different our perspectives were. He said I was all about structure and function, while he focused more on how spaces make people feel." He looked at her directly. He asked if I ever thought about how our home makes you feel. The question Mark's question, now transmitted through David, hung in the twilight air between them. Elizabeth set down her wine glass, suddenly afraid her trembling hands might betray her. "And what did you say?" she asked. I realized I didn't know the answer. David's admission was quiet, laced with regret. "Isn't that terrible? After 18 years, I couldn't say with certainty how our home makes my wife feel." The conversation was veering into dangerous territory. Elizabeth felt simultaneously touched by David's self-awareness and terrified by the implications of Mark's influence. "Our home is beautiful," she said carefully. "You know, I put a lot of thought into the design. That's not what I'm asking." David's voice was gentle but insistent. "I'm asking how you feel in our life together. Not just the house, but us." Elizabeth looked away, focusing on the darkening garden. How could she answer honestly without causing pain? How could she express the complex tangle of love, loyalty, dissatisfaction, and yearning that constituted her emotional state? "I love you," she began, because that much was true. "But sometimes I feel invisible. Like we've become so comfortable with each other that we don't really see each other anymore." David was silent for a long moment, absorbing her words. "I don't want you to feel invisible," he finally said. "Ever." He reached for her hand across the small table, his fingers wrapping around hers with unexpected urgency. "Elizabeth." He reached for her hand across the small table, his fingers wrapping around hers with unexpected urgency. Elizabeth felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness but from the raw honesty of the moment. "I don't want to be invisible either," David continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I think maybe we both disappeared into routines, into work, into being Lily's parents. And somewhere along the way, we stopped being David and Elizabeth." The perceptiveness of his observation both comforted and pained her. This was the man she had fallen in love with, thoughtful, introspective, capable of profound understanding. How had they drifted so far from each other? And why was it taking another man's interest to jolt them back toward connection? "I want us to find each other again," Elizabeth said softly. "I think we're worth fighting for." David squeezed her hand. "Me too." They sat in companionable silence as darkness enveloped the garden. The moment felt like a beginning, a chance to rebuild what had eroded. Yet as Elizabeth looked at her husband's familiar profile, she couldn't help but wonder if this awakening had come too late, if the stirring in her heart that Mark had initiated could be quietly set aside. Monday morning dawned with heavy rain, unusual for the season. Elizabeth stood at the kitchen window watching water stream down the glass, distorting the view of their carefully landscaped yard. The weather matched her mood, unsettled, with currents running beneath the surface. Her phone chimed with a text message. "Mark, need to discuss some venue details before Wednesday's meeting. Are you free for lunch today?" Elizabeth stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the reply button. A lunch meeting would be perfectly innocent, perfectly professional. Yet she knew, with a certainty that left no room for self-deception, that nothing between them could be truly innocent anymore. After her conversation with David the previous evening, the right course of action seemed clear. She should decline, suggest a phone call instead, establish a boundary that would protect her marriage, and signal to Mark that whatever had been developing between them needed to stop. Before she could reply, another text arrived. "If it's easier, we could meet at the venue." The hotel manager offered to walk us through some technical considerations for the lighting design. The addition of a third party made the invitation more acceptable, less intimate. Elizabeth typed a response. "Venue at 1 p.m. works. See you there." She set down her phone, telling herself this was a practical decision, a professional choice. Yet she couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation at the thought of seeing Mark again, nor the guilt that accompanied it. When David came downstairs, dressed for work in a charcoal suit and blue tie, Elizabeth mentioned the venue meeting casually. "I'll be meeting Mark and the hotel manager at lunchtime to discuss technical details for the gala." David nodded, pouring himself coffee. "Good. That project seems to be coming along well." His lack of concern should have been reassuring. Instead, it left Elizabeth feeling oddly hollow, as if she wanted him to object, to stake a claim, to see what she herself was reluctant to acknowledge. "I'm considering asking Lily to come home for the gala," she said, changing the subject. She could use a weekend away from campus, and it would be nice to have her there. "Great idea." David smiled, the mention of their daughter brightening his expression. "She'd enjoy seeing what her mother has created." He kissed her cheek before heading out, an affectionate gesture that had become more frequent since their patio conversation. Elizabeth watched him go, rain dripping from his umbrella as he walked to his car, and felt a surge of tenderness that complicated her already confused emotions. The morning dragged by, filled with client calls and fabric selections that failed to hold her attention. At 12:30, Elizabeth changed into rain boots and grabbed her umbrella, telling her assistant she had a venue meeting for the hospital fundraiser. The hotel was only 15 minutes from her design studio. Elizabeth arrived early, shaking rainwater from her umbrella in the grand lobby. She used the extra time to visit the ladies' room, where she applied fresh lipstick and smoothed her hair, then immediately questioned her motivations for doing so. When she returned to the lobby, Mark was there, dressed in a navy suit with a light gray shirt, no tie. The casual elegance of his appearance contrasted with David's more traditional attire. He smiled when he saw her, the warmth in his expression causing a small leap in her chest. "Elizabeth, thank you for coming on such short notice." "Of course. Is the hotel manager meeting us?" Mark's expression turned apologetic. She had an emergency with another event, but she left the key to the ballroom with instructions for what she wanted to show us regarding the lighting grids. The revelation that they would be alone after all should have prompted Elizabeth to suggest rescheduling. Instead, she nodded, following him toward the elevators. "I hope it's nothing that will impact our design concept. I'm sure we can adapt if necessary." The elevator ride was brief but charged with awareness. They stood on opposite sides of a small space, yet Elizabeth felt as if invisible threads connected them, pulling tighter with each passing second. The ballroom was dark when they entered, emergency lights casting long shadows across the empty floor. Mark found the light panel and illuminated the space partially, creating pools of light rather than full brightness. "The manager wanted to show us the limitations of a current lighting system," he explained, gesturing toward the ceiling where tracks of adjustable lights were mounted. "Apparently some sections are functioning properly." They walked the space together, professional discussion masking the undercurrent between them. Elizabeth found herself hyper-aware of his proximity as they examined lighting positions and electrical outlets. When their hands accidentally brushed as they both reached for a light switch, the contact sent a jolt through her that was disproportionate to the innocent touch. "Sorry," they said in unison, then laughed awkwardly. They continued their inspection, moving to the small anteroom where Elizabeth had proposed setting up the children's art display. The space felt more intimate than the main ballroom, the lower ceiling and single window creating an atmosphere of seclusion. "I was thinking," Mark said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty room, "that we could install special lighting here to highlight the artwork. Something that would make each piece feel important, valuable." Elizabeth nodded, picturing his suggestion. "Like museum lighting. That would be perfect. The children deserve to have their work showcased properly." He moved to stand beside her, looking at the blank wall where the artwork would hang. To be seen, really seen. The emphasis in his words carried meaning beyond the immediate context. Elizabeth turned to face him, finding him closer than she expected. "Mark," she began, uncertain what would follow his name. "I know." His voice was low, his eyes holding hers. "I know this is complicated. I know there are lines we shouldn't cross. But I can't stop thinking about you, Elizabeth." The directness of his admission left no room for pretense. They had moved beyond implied interest into explicit territory, and Elizabeth knew her response would determine what happened next. "David and I had a long talk this weekend," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. About our marriage. About trying harder. Mark nodded, his expression somber. That's good. That's what should happen. Yes. And yet you're here. The simple observation cut through her rationalizations. Elizabeth took a step back, creating distance between them. To discuss lighting for the gala. Is that the only reason? She could lie, maintain the fiction that her interest was purely professional. Instead, she chose honesty. No. The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Mark didn't move toward her, respecting the physical boundary she had established, but his gaze remained steady, unwavering. What do you want, Elizabeth? Not what you should want, or what's expected of you. What do you actually want? The question stripped away pretense, forcing her to confront desires she had been avoiding. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild temperature of the room. I want to feel alive again, she said finally. I want to be seen and heard and valued. I want passion and curiosity and conversation that goes beyond scheduling and logistics. She paused, gathering courage. And yes, part of me wants you. The confession relieved and terrified her simultaneously. Mark's expression softened, but he maintained the distance between them. And David! I love David! The truth of the statement was undeniable, even as she acknowledged her attraction to another man. We've built a life together. We have history, shared memories, a daughter we both adore. But somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing each other. We became comfortable, then complacent. Elizabeth sighed. And now he's trying again, reaching out, making an effort because he senses something's wrong. And I feel guilty because it took another man's interest to wake us both up. Mark absorbed her words, his expression thoughtful. You know, in architecture, we talk about negative space, the empty areas that define and give meaning to the physical structures around them. In a way, maybe I'm the negative space in your marriage right now. The absence that's highlighting what's actually there. The perspective startled her with its insight and generosity. Most men, confronted with being a potential catalyst rather than a destination, would retreat or push harder. Mark was doing neither. That's a charitable way of looking at it, she said. I'm not feeling particularly charitable. A smile touched his lips briefly. I want you, Elizabeth. I think about you constantly. I imagine conversations with you throughout my day. I find myself waiting for your emails, analyzing every word. It's maddening and wonderful and completely inappropriate. His honesty matched her own, creating a strange intimacy that transcended physical contact. They stood in the dimly lit anteroom, two people acknowledging an attraction that could not be pursued without cost. What happens now? She asked, the practical question belying the emotional complexity of their situation. That depends on you, Mark replied. I meant what I said before. I respect your marriage. I won't pursue you if you decide to recommit to David, but I won't pretend I don't feel what I feel either. And if I can't decide, if I'm torn, then we continue as we are colleagues working on a project together, aware of what exists between us but not acting on it. He took a deep breath. But Elizabeth, you should know that indecision is its own kind of decision. The longer you remain in limbo, the more damage you do to both relationships. The wisdom in his observation struck her forcefully. By not choosing, she was effectively choosing to maintain an emotional connection with Mark while preventing her marriage from truly healing. It wasn't fair to anyone, not to David, not to Mark, and not to herself. I need time, she said finally, to figure out what I really want, what I really need. Mark nodded. Take the time, but be honest with yourself about why you're taking it. A sound from the main ballroom, the door opening, voices echoing, interrupted their conversation. The hotel manager had arrived after all, her emergency apparently resolved. There you are, she called, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor as she approached the anteroom. So sorry I'm late. Let me show you what I was concerned about with the lighting system. The moment between them broken, Elizabeth and Mark shifted seamlessly into professional roles, following the manager through the technical details of the venue. Yet undercurrents remained, invisible but powerful, like the geological forces that shape landscapes over time. When the meeting concluded an hour later, they walked together to the hotel lobby in silence. Rain still fell steadily outside, gray sheets of water blurring the boundaries between sky and earth. I should get back to work, Elizabeth said, opening her umbrella. "Elizabeth!" Mark's voice stopped her. "Whatever you decide, know that meeting you has changed me. I hadn't felt genuine connection with someone in years before you. That matters, regardless of what happens next." His words touched something deep within her, the recognition that even unfulfilled connections could transform us, could awaken parts of ourselves we had forgotten or neglected. "It matters to me too," she replied softly before stepping into the rain. The drive back to her office was a blur of windshield wipers and gray streets. Elizabeth's mind replayed her conversation with Mark, analyzing each word, each implication. He had essentially given her permission to choose her marriage without recrimination, an act of generosity that only increased her admiration for him. Yet the pull toward him remained strong, the excitement of new discovery, the thrill of being truly seen and valued, the passionate connection that had developed between them despite their mutual restraint. By the time she reached her office, Elizabeth had made a decision. Not the ultimate choice between her marriage and the possibility that Mark represented, but a choice about how to proceed until that larger decision crystallized. She would give her marriage a genuine chance at renewal. She would open herself to David's efforts at reconnection, contribute her own energy toward rebuilding what had eroded, and see if what they had once shared could be not just recovered but transformed into something new and vital. At the same time, she would establish clearer boundaries with Mark. Professional interaction only, preferably in group settings. No private meetings, no coffee conversations, no exchanges that could deepen their emotional connection. The decision felt right, responsible, ethical, mature. Yet as Elizabeth sat in her parked car, rain drumming on the roof, she couldn't deny the ache of loss that accompanied it. Something beautiful and rare had begun between her and Mark, a connection that might have flourished under different circumstances. That evening, David arrived home early, carrying a small wrapped package. "For you," he said, presenting it to Elizabeth with a smile that reminded her of their early dating years, slightly nervous, eager to please. She unwrapped it to find a leather-bound journal, the cover embossed with an intricate design of intertwining branches. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely touched. "I thought you might want to start sketching again," David explained. "You used to always have a journal with you, capturing ideas, making quick drawings. I haven't seen you do that in years." The thoughtfulness of a gift moved her deeply. David had noticed something she herself had forgotten, a habit, a passion that had once been central to her creative process. "Thank you," she said, reaching up to kiss him with genuine warmth. "I love it." They cooked dinner together, moving around the kitchen with growing ease, their conversation flowing more naturally than it had in months. David told her about a new project. He was considering a community center in an underserved neighborhood, work that would be more socially impactful than the commercial developments that had become his specialty. "It wouldn't be as lucrative," he admitted, "but I think it might be more fulfilling." "You should do it," Elizabeth encouraged, recognizing the spark of passion in his eyes. "You've always been at your best when you're designing spaces that improve people's lives." Later, as they sat together on the living room sofa, David's arm around her shoulders, Elizabeth felt a tentative hope building within her. Perhaps they could find their way back to each other. Perhaps the emotional distance that had grown between them could be bridged through mutual effort and renewed curiosity. Her phone chimed with a text message. She glanced at it, her heart constricting when she saw Mark's name on the screen. David felt her tense. "Work?" he asked. Elizabeth hesitated, then chose honesty. "It's Mark, probably about the gala." "You should check it," David said, his tone neutral. "Could be important." She opened the message. "Just wanted to say I respect your decision. I'll step back from the committee leadership role and let Angela take over as your primary contact. I think that's best for everyone." Mark had intuited her decision without her having to articulate it. The consideration implicit in his message, removing himself from direct interaction with her, touched her deeply. He was making it easier for her to choose her marriage, sacrificing his own desires for her well-being. "Everything okay?" David asked, noticing her extended silence. "Yes," she said, setting down the phone. "Just some committee restructuring." She wouldn't tell David about the emotional connection that had developed between her and Mark. Nothing physical had occurred, and revealing the intensity of her feelings now would only cause pain without purpose. Some truths served no one. The following weeks brought a gradual reawakening in Elizabeth's marriage. David made consistent efforts to engage with her beyond logistics and schedules, asking about her design work, suggesting weekend activities, initiating physical intimacy with renewed attention to her pleasure. Elizabeth reciprocated, sharing her thoughts more openly, expressing her needs more clearly, allowing herself to be vulnerable in ways she had avoided for years. The gala planning continued, with Angela serving as Elizabeth's primary committee contact, as Mark had arranged. Elizabeth saw him occasionally at full committee meetings, their interactions polite but distant. She felt his gaze on her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, a mixture of admiration and resignation in his expression. Each time, her heart constricted with what might have been. 2 weeks before the gala, David surprised her with plane tickets to Florence for their upcoming anniversary. "I'm making good on that promise," he said, eyes twinkling with pleasure at her stunned expression. 19 years late, but better than never, right? The gesture brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes, not just for the gift itself, but for what it represented. David was fighting for their marriage, making significant efforts to address the dissatisfaction she had expressed. "It's perfect," she said, embracing him tightly. "Thank you." The night of the gala arrived, the ballroom transformed according to Elizabeth's vision. Soft lighting created intimate spaces within the larger room. Elegant table settings gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and in the anteroom, children's artwork was displayed with museum-quality lighting, each piece framed and honored. Elizabeth wore a midnight blue gown that draped elegantly across her figure, her auburn hair swept up to reveal the curve of her neck. David, handsome in his tuxedo, kept his hand at the small of her back as they moved through the crowd, introducing her to colleagues and donors with evident pride. "My wife designed all of this," he told a major hospital benefactor. "Transformed the space completely." The praise warmed her, especially because it was genuine. David had always acknowledged her professional accomplishments, but tonight there was something more in his tone, a recognition of her as a complete person, not just a wife with a career. Inevitably, they encountered Mark at the bar. He looked striking in his tuxedo, the formal attire emphasizing his lean physique and quiet elegance. For a moment, the three of them stood in an awkward triangle, the unspoken complexity of their relationship hanging in the air. "Henderson," David extended his hand. "The gala looks like a tremendous success. The firm should be proud of its contribution." "The success belongs to your wife," Mark replied, shaking David's hand while his eyes briefly met Elizabeth's. Her vision transformed the space. "She has that effect," David said, his arm slipping around Elizabeth's waist in a gesture that was both affectionate and subtly proprietary. Transforming spaces, transforming lives. Elizabeth felt caught between past and present, possibility and reality. David's renewed attention and effort had revitalized their marriage in ways she hadn't thought possible. Yet standing before Mark, she couldn't deny the connection that still hummed between them, a road not taken, a possibility unrealized. "If you'll excuse me," Mark said with a polite smile, "I see the hospital director trying to get my attention." David, Elizabeth, enjoy the evening. As he walked away, Elizabeth watched him go, aware that some part of her heart went with him, the part that had awakened to new possibilities, to the recognition that even after decades of marriage, she remained a woman capable of passion, desire, and profound connection. "He's a good architect," David commented, misinterpreting her gaze. "The firm's lucky to have him." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed softly. "Very lucky." Later that evening, as the gala reached its pinnacle with the announcement of record-breaking donations for the children's hospital expansion, Elizabeth slipped away to the anteroom for a moment of quiet. The children's artwork surrounded her expressions of hope, imagination, and resilience amid difficult circumstances. She heard the door open behind her and knew without turning that it was Mark. Some awareness between them transcended visual confirmation. "The gala is a tremendous success," he said, keeping his distance. "You should be proud." "We all should be," she replied, turning to face him. The committee worked hard. They regarded each other in silence for a moment, so much unspoken yet understood between them. "Are you happy, Elizabeth?" Mark asked finally, echoing the question David had posed weeks earlier on their patio. She considered the question seriously, owing him the truth. "I'm working toward happiness," she said. David and I both are. Mark nodded, accepting her answer. That's good. That's what I want for you. And you? She asked. Are you happy? A sad smile crossed his face. I'm reconciling myself to possibilities that won't be realized. But knowing you has been illuminating. You reminded me of what connection can feel like. Elizabeth felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Mark, You don't need to explain, he interrupted gently. I understand choices and consequences. I respect the decision you've made. He took a step toward her, then stopped himself, maintaining the invisible boundary between them. I just wanted to tell you that the children's artwork display is perfect. You saw what these kids needed to be valued, to be seen as artists in their own right rather than patients. That vision, that empathy, is what makes you extraordinary. The compliment touched her deeply because it recognized something essential about her approach to design, to life. Thank you. Mark glanced toward the door. I should get back to the gala. Yes, we both should. Neither moved. In the quiet anteroom, surrounded by expressions of hope and possibility, they stood at the crossroads of what was and what might have been. In another life, Mark said softly. In another life, Elizabeth echoed, the phrase acknowledging both the connection they shared and the reality that would keep them apart. He nodded once, then turned and left the room, the door closing quietly behind him. Elizabeth remained among the children's artwork for several minutes, composing herself before returning to the gala, to David, to the life she had chosen to recommit to and rebuild. When she finally emerged from the anteroom, David was waiting for her in the main ballroom, his face lighting up when he spotted her. He extended his hand, and she took it, allowing him to lead her to the dance floor as the orchestra played a slow melody. Have I told you how beautiful you look tonight? He murmured as they moved together to the music. Yes, but I don't mind hearing it again, she replied with a smile. Beautiful and brilliant. His arms tightened around her. I'm a lucky man, Elizabeth Morgan. As they danced, Elizabeth caught sight of Mark across the room, watching them with a complexity of emotion in his eyes, admiration, resignation, and a touch of what might have been longing. Their gazes held for a brief moment before he turned away, disappearing into the crowd. Elizabeth leaned her head against David's shoulder, closing her eyes. The choice had been made. Not the easy choice, not the thrilling choice, but the one that honored commitment, history, and the possibility of renewed love. Yet as the music surrounded them, and David held her close, Elizabeth acknowledged silently that Mark had given her a precious gift amid the complexity and confusion. He had reminded her that she was still capable of feeling deeply, of forming profound connections, of being seen and valued for exactly who she was. That awakening would remain with her, informing her marriage in ways neither she nor David might fully understand. In the ballroom that she had transformed from emptiness to elegance, Elizabeth danced with her husband, carrying within her heart the weight of what was, what might have been, and what could still be a complexity of emotion as intricate and beautiful as the silent spaces between stars. The road not taken would always exist in some parallel universe of possibility. But the road she had chosen stretched before her, not a retreat to what had been, but a path towards something new, a marriage reawakened to possibility, to effort, to the daily choice of loving not just out of habit or history, but with intention and presence. As the music ended, and David led her from the dance floor, Elizabeth glanced once more around the ballroom, her gaze briefly meeting Mark's across the crowded space. No words were exchanged, no gestures made, yet in that momentary connection was an acknowledgement of what they had shared and what they had chosen to relinquish. Some questions have no perfect answers, Elizabeth realized. Some stories have no neat conclusions. Life was composed of choices made and unmade, of roads taken and not taken, of silent spaces filled with meaning and possibility. The weight of water of emotions held and released, of desires acknowledged and set aside would always remain. But within that weight was also buoyancy, the capacity to rise and move forward, carrying what mattered, releasing what did not. Elizabeth turned her focus fully to David, to the man who had been her companion for nearly 2 decades, who was making his own journey toward renewal and reconnection. The future stretched before them uncertain, unwritten, full of possibility. And in that possibility lay all the answers she needed for now.